I reached 10,000 subscribers. No jokes or dry humor. Thank you all sincerely. This journey has been a blast, and thanks for sticking with me through it. I think the way different forms of media depict the idea of extraterrestrial life to be kind of a Rorschach test for the people making the media. Do they imagine life to be like us, down to even vague appearance? Will they be little more than animals, and we intellectually alone? Will they be far beyond us in intelligence or scale? I think how a person answers these questions could say a lot about them and how they think of life on our own planet. Which is why the only thing I'd ask whoever is the creator of the Fallen is, who hurt you? Because it feels like when I look at them that I'm looking at an entire species built on trauma. Speaking of trauma, hi, I'm the Hearth Guy, and of all the antagonistic forces we've come across in the world of Destiny, these folks are easily my favorite. Not necessarily the overall best villains, as I've already said, that's the Hive, but the Fallen work better as a people as opposed to just villains. Although I should be clear, their name is not the Fallen. That's a term humanity gave them when they started showing up after the collapse. Their true name is the Eliksni, and their story can be a cautionary tale for what humanity could have become. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is linked to my other videos, specifically my first 2 Destiny videos, so I'd suggest you take a look at those before continuing here. Either way, we should start with who the Eliksni actually are. Physically speaking, they're an insectoid race with 4 arms usually, a split mandible, and reproduce via egg-laying. They're honestly pretty tough creatures, able to survive in many hostile environments with minimal assistance besides maybe a rebreather. Eliksni also regularly can go through a molting process, discarding their old shell and growing larger as they age, though naturally they stop when they reach certain maturity as opposed to a lot of other insect species that just keep growing. Of course, that heavily has to do with a certain substance, ether, a gaseous substance found in abundance on their home planet of Reese. Regular consumption of ether is what stimulated natural growth in an Eliksni, and enough could even allow for one to regrow lost limbs should the need arise. Through continued absorption of ether, an Eliksni could feasibly live forever, and many we meet have been around for centuries. And it was prevalent and free for all thanks to the presence of our favorite space golf ball, the Traveler, who had become the patron of the Eliksni culture centuries prior. It brought to them a golden age which surpassed even humanity's as they expanded across multiple star systems and developed a vibrant culture and religion around the worship of the Traveler, which they called the Great Machine, sparking a reverence of machines in all sorts. Because of that, another role rose to prominence in their society, that of the Splicer, who could mold and shape technology for either construction, circumvention, or enhancement of their fellow Eliksni. Splicers had a sacred position in this machine-worshipping society, but the central structure of Reese's culture was that of the houses. Every Eliksni could be found as a member of a great house, which was essentially a tribe or clan, which carried their own specialties and histories. At first, these houses warred with each other during the Edge Wars, but the houses of Kings and Judgment worked together to reform Eliksni society so peace would be more secure. Each house had a place, and the House of Judgment existed as scribes and mediators between all of them, while the House of Kings presumably took a prominent role in the new society. There were also the Houses of Rain, Wolves, Winter, Stone, and more, though it should be stated that those names are more human translations. After all, the Eliksni didn't have wolves, but the closest translations we have for their name is wolf. Each house also had 2 main leaders, an Archon, which was effectively a high priest, and a Kel, which was their more traditional leader. Their own golden age, which really began after the Edge Wars and the restructuring of their society, was not meant to last forever, however. Much like our own, as the Black Fleet headed by the eternal pursuer of the Traveler that was the Witness, with Oryx close behind. And if you thought the collapse humanity suffered was bad, the whirlwind of the Eliksni was atrocious. For a while, their golden age soared higher than ours, so too was their fall greater, as their civilization was erased by attacks from outside and conflict within. Their great machine fled from the Witness just as it had done many times before, and several great houses were wiped out. Notably, the House of Stone, tasked with defending the Eliksni, were the final bulwark to break against Oryx's Taken, as their Kel, Kelkis's final stand, allowed the last survivors to escape into deep space, and there they became Fallen. Among them were the houses I mentioned, though admittedly weakened, and many of their leaders were disheartened. But they ultimately decided to chase after the Great Machine in hopes of returning it to Reese and reigniting their civilization. Thus began the Long Rift, a centuries-long voyage through the stars following the Traveler's path inside their ketches, massive ships which became sacred homes after the loss of Reese. the peaceful society of old broke down in the void of space. With no natural source of ether, their servitors, large machines based off the Traveler, were the only way to make more, and the supply was tightly controlled by the Kells and Archons. The servitors went on to become the center of their faith, as the great machine was far from their reach, which in turn elevated the Archons to even higher positions of power. But the long drift forced many of their old customs to be done away with in the name of survival, and a new hierarchy within the houses was born as Kells became more ruthless, docking the limbs of lesser Eliksni and only allowing them enough ether to live, stunting the growth of many, and allowing others to grow larger than natural with excess ether. The once strong sense of unity between houses was breaking down as loyalty within each house was enforced with strength. To make matters worse, some took to abandoning the houses altogether and crafting fleets of their own from stolen catches, becoming pirate lords called catch killers. But the Eliksni would survive, and reach the Great Machine's new home, shortly following yet another whirlwind. But this time, their god had not abandoned its new children, and this enraged them. Seeing humanity protected still under the god they were abandoned by made the disparate Eliksni agree on one thing. They had to take the Great Machine back by force. And so we reach the era known as the Eliksni Siege, which is a century's worth of time where the Fallen and the Last City would battle repeatedly. While the Hive has been the most prevalent in modern Destiny, in the years before the game, the Fallen most certainly were humanity's greatest threat. Most stories of refugees on Earth are those of the Fallen and the suffering they inflicted on humanity. And many characters we know of and interact with today in Destiny can trace a major part of their lives back to this time. Whether they survived the fall of Reese, were born in the Long Drift, they all lived to see the Great Machine now protected by Guardians, who held powers that their god never blessed them with. Resentment brewed in the hearts of the Eliksni people as they terrorized the disparate peoples of Earth, and came into conflict with Lightbearers as both Guardians and Iron Lords defended their people. Horrific atrocities were committed by some Fallen, such as wiping out an entire settlement on Mercury, and by the accounts of Saint 14 who witnessed the attack, eating children for food. Things only got more tense for the two groups as the last city was built beneath the Traveler, because now the Fallen had a singular big target. The walls of the city were barely built when the House of Devils fell on them from all sides in what would become the Battle of Six Fronts. And though it was a fierce conflict, all it served to do was inspire the establishment of the Titans as a symbol of the city's defense. Something I didn't really touch on before is that, at least in the lore, there's some evidence to suggest a Guardian's class is entirely self-confining. As in, they use their powers like that out of personal preference or philosophy, not because they're limited to it. The fact Savathun, a later Hive Guardian, can use aspects of multiple Guardian classes seems to suggest this, but more to the point, the Battle of Six Fronts is what made Titans be seen as, well, Titans. Titan orders had existed beforehand, but I think the fact that a hexagon split into 4 segments representing the 4 Titan orders that defended the walls became the symbol for the Titans as a class tells you how impactful this battle was at defining who the Titans were as a group. And all the Fallen got out of it was a lot of dead soldiers and a greater enemy. Since Saint 14 resigned his post as Vanguard Commander to begin tearing and shredding into Eliksni with a level of ferocity that'd make Doomguy tell him to take a chill pill. I've discussed the nightmares he inflicted on the Vex, but the trauma he brought to the Eliksni was legitimately cultural. Saint 14 became their equivalent to the Grim Reaper, a figure of synonymous death and destruction, whose likeness was used to scare children into behaving and not straying too far. He shattered house after house of theirs, slaughtering their leadership and breaking their servitors before his crusade was over and he returned to the city. Around this same time, Saint was also supposed to kill a certain Fallen called Tannix, but Cade 6 beat him to it and killed him. But that'd be far from the worst battle he or anyone would see, as once more the House of Devils would be at the front of an attack on the city, although this time it would be plotted by the last Kell of the House of Kings, Krask. In what the Eliksni would call the final attempt, the House of Kings, alongside the Devils and Winter, would descend on the last city at many points. But the place that really mattered, where the blood really fell, was a place in their defenses that was deemed impossible to save. Twilight Gap. Here, a single fire team led by Lord Shaxx held the line to a sea of fallen armaments, soldiers, and artillery. If they had not done this, and if the House of Wolves, which was supposed to join the attack, were not intercepted by the Awoken in the asteroid belt, then the city likely would have fallen. But this final attempt by the Eliksni would fail in the end, and the Guardians would come out stronger. Shaxx began organizing the Crucible as a way for the Guardians to strengthen themselves, and the Vanguard began coordinating major offensive strikes rather than just holding up inside their walls. And Saint went out again to break the backs of the Fallen who had attacked them, dueling and killing the Kell of the House of Devils with a brutal and legendary headbutt. Around this time, Andelbrass, the Hunter Vanguard, was killed by a certain Fallen named Tannix, but Cade 6 hunted him down and killed him. Wait. Also, due to their interference, the Awoken were wrapped up in their own wars called the Reef Wars, as the House of Wolves would eventually be brought to heel and made vassals to the Awoken Queen Mara. Due to the schemes of a House of Judgment member and one who had lived through the whirlwind, Varix. And it's these events that precluded the story of Destiny. By the time we show up, the Fallen have really, well, fallen. They aren't reinforcing themselves anymore, and are half the time fighting amongst themselves. The final attempt was an accurate title, as they have never been able to manage an invasion of that level. Instead, their culture has withered in the shadows of the solar system, raiding and stealing what they can as they fruitlessly struggle to reclaim even an ounce of what they had. The House of Wolves rebelled against the Awoken only to be smacked down by the Guardians and shattered, killing their leadership and even a certain Fallen called Tannix, who was hired by the House to help them. Okay, hold on. When Oryx came to the system, every house was ravaged by the Taken as their own kin were turned into monsters before their eyes. And the House of Devils would attempt one last great scheme to weaponize the nanotechnology of Siva to remake themselves as, what they saw, as demigods, half flesh and half machine. Of course, the Guardians and the last Iron Lord Saladin saw to their demise, as well as many Siva-enhanced Eliksni who worked with them, such as a certain Fallen named Tannix. Okay, are we sure he's not a Guardian? Where we stand now, most of those houses have given up their titles and have been merged into the House of Dusk, a newer house with a loose structure with only survival in mind. From this mess of a people fighting to make something of themselves again, we get some of the best characters in Destiny, and some of the most interesting development for an entire culture. Varix, who I mentioned before, is a scheming negotiator that is played as both friend and foe to us, but whose plans have repeatedly caused more havoc than he could handle. He's also the oldest Eliksni we've had interacting with us since early Destiny 1. For a more sinister figure, we have Fikro, a fanatical Eliksni who, due to the interference of an Ahamkara, which are paracausal genie dragons, and the desire of Uldren Sov, the brother of Queen Mara, he was reborn as a new brand of Eliksni altogether, Scorn. Scorn are suffused with ether which have been tainted by darkness, changing them into effectively undead that Fikro could command and resurrect at will. Fikro's Scorn did what no other Fallen had been able to do since the final attempt. Make the Guardians afraid and very, very angry through the killing of Cade 6, which would also be the first time we genuinely ally with Eliksni that weren't directly under another's control, through the Spider, a crime boss which ran the reef as his own little fiefdom until the Scorn began breaking things. Spider's brother Civix also ran a gang which was actively out to abandon the old ways and even infiltrated the last city with a heavy artillery weapon. But as you can imagine, that ended poorly for him. Furthermore, we have Aramis, the ship stealer, another who had lived on Reese and watched it fall, and watched as her god abandoned them, who became a leader in the House of Devils, and she would seek another way forward, turning her back on the Traveler entirely to seek its opposite, reaching the icy moon of Europa and finding the darkness and the power of stasis, which would be the first time a form of darkness was weaponized against us outside the Hive, and the first time we'd be able to use that same power for ourselves. Her new House of Salvation was a genuine threat, the first one the Eliksni had posed in years, and if it weren't for us also learning to wield stasis, then the House of Salvation could have succeeded in making a new Reese, as Aramis wanted, on the bones of the last city. Wielding paracausal powers at the time, especially powers like stasis rather than the sort of vague stuff the Hive used a lot of the time, was an incredibly big deal, and an especially big deal that it was the Fallen of all people who were using it. The very first enemy type that most of us likely ever fought was now the first one to start using powers like our own to fight against us. And frankly, considering how broken stasis was when it first came out, it was a brutal learning curve. But, as a contrast to Aramis, Mithrax the Forsaken. Once a catch killer born on the long journey from Reese and foster brother to the Spider and Civix, Mithrax, or Mithrax to the human tongue, has had a long journey of his own. From a ruthless pirate that abandoned his brothers on an asteroid and held an artifact of darkness as a trophy, to a member of the House of Wolves and then prisoner to the Awoken, to then an agent of Sior Ido, the lover of the Awoken Queen, to again a member of a fallen house in the House of Dusk, to at last an ally to humanity with the founding of the House of Light, with himself as the Kel and his adoptive daughter, named in honor of his now deceased friend Ido, as the Scribe. And unlike past Kels, he would not hoard ether and grow from it. He'd only take what he needed and pass the rest on. He'd remember the old ways and worship the great machine as a divine splicer, a practice which had all but died out. And he would, thankfully for us, use that power to become friends with the Guardians. And he'd even find himself standing side by side with the Saint, the monster of his people, with himself also a monster the children of the city lived in fear of. But when the city's people needed them, he'd be there for them and his own, and both Mithrax and Saint 14 would see the people behind the ghost stories and bring both sides closer to defeat the greater enemy of the Vex. Mithrax's story, even abridged as I told it, is far too long and detailed to get into here and now, but needless to say, his has been a mirror to his people, pulled back and forth between abandoning and returning to the things that they've known, hating humanity and being bound to the Awoken, trying to build something new and ultimately finding peace by letting go of their past grievances. Mithrax opened the way for the Eliksni and humanity to walk side by side, from being perhaps our oldest enemy to being the first non-humans who we ally ourselves with. Each of these characters are answers to the problems facing the Eliksni, whether they abandon or double down on tradition, embrace the darkness or seek out the light, curse humanity or strive to walk beside them. It's such that the Eliksni are truly my favorite group within Destiny, and to me are more dynamic than the Hive, Vex, or Cabal, and most definitely more so than the Dread, Taken, or Scorn. I mean, those last three don't even get their own videos. That's just because the Scorn have literally nothing going on besides Fikrul, which I've already talked about. The Taken are basically just an extension of the Hive, and the Dread are boring, and they haven't been here long enough to do anything really interesting. Meanwhile, every character I mentioned evolves across their time in the story. Varix is now a tentative ally whose involvement with the release of the Scorn leaves him at an arm's length compared to where he was when we first met him. Even so, his dedication to helping his people grow makes him a steadfast asset to the House of Light. Spider's influence has waned, and now he finds himself forced to work under the watchful eye of the Vanguard in the city, meaning he's more inclined to play nice. Fikrul has certainly changed, as, at least by now, he has attempted to remake the Eliksni in the image of his Scorn, and he's had to redefine his purpose now that Uldren, the one who put him on this path, was reborn as Crow, our ally and the Hunter Vanguard. And he's sort of developed into a more deranged and threatening enemy to our Guardians than he once was. Not to mention the fact that Fikrul can constantly revive himself means that he's one of the few enemies that can go toe-to-toe with the constantly reviving Guardians. And Aramis has experienced perhaps the most change on screen of any of them, as her prior hatred of humanity has clashed with her desire for the Eliksni's happiness. Seeing House Light thrive where House Salvation has fallen apart has made her make more than a few terrible decisions and wound up with her serving the Witness and helping Xivu Wrath. Now, however, with even them unable to guide her, she started to help us, as it means helping her people, especially at the urging of Mithrax's daughter Ido, who represents a more hopeful and, I'd argue, frankly naive vision for the future, but Ido's impact is most likely going to be what leads the Eliksni going forward. Though suffering has been the most frequent feeling the Eliksni have felt for centuries, we've borne witness to a complete transformation of them from generic enemies that people call elite clones into one whose characters don't follow any simple rhyme or reason. Our number of Cabal characters that we directly interact with are fairly slim. The Vex have practically none, and though the Hive do better, let's be honest, there's a reason Luzaku was so novel to us when we met her. Not to downplay Luzaku, I think I speak for all of us when I say we blow up a planet to protect her, but let's be honest, she's no Randall the Vandal. Miss that guy. Real ones remember Randall. In both lore, story, gameplay, and heart, the Eliksni are downright irreplaceable to what Destiny has become now. Whether as our enemy or friends, the very core of this game would be fundamentally different if they weren't part of it. As Mithrax, my favorite character in all of Destiny is the clear demonstration of those that fall the farthest can rise just as much and beyond. And that will be all today, Guardians. And I just want to say thank you all so much for watching. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share the video around if you liked it. A huge shout out to all my patrons and channel members, sustaining me and helping me grow as Ether does to an angry and belligerent Kel. If you too would like to do the same, consider becoming a patron or channel member, but even if you don't, your time and attention has been greatly appreciated. No matter what, Thank you all for your time, and remember, I am the Hearth Guy, and I will see you all next time around the hearth. Do any of you know Warhammer 40k, and how the Imperium of Man is a smoking crap sack constantly out to commit as much brutal conquest as possible? Well, what if I told you there was a group just like them, with all the cool parts, and none of the bad? Honor-bound combat, Roman/Byzantine theming, a star-spanning empire, and, oh, they've taken the city. By the way, they also have the brutal conquest part, too. Have fun.